Hidden Crime Stories, The Golden State Killer. The story of Joseph James DeAngelo. He was standing in his driveway when they came for him. April 24, 2018. A quiet suburban street in Citrus Heights, California. The kind of neighborhood where people wave at each other from their driveways and complain about the weather and go about their ordinary days without thinking very much about the darkness that might be living right next door to them. The man in the driveway was 72 years old. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and cargo shorts and tube socks pulled up too high the way old men sometimes wear them. He looked exactly like what his neighbors believed he was. A retired grandfather puttering around his house on a Tuesday afternoon. When the investigators moved in, he did not run. He did not fight. He did not reach for anything or try to disappear the way a man who had spent 40 years evading capture might be expected to do. He just stood there, blinking, stunned. And then he said something that has stayed with everyone who was there that afternoon. Something so mundane, so absurdly ordinary, that it almost broke the moment entirely. He said, "I have a roast in the oven." That was it. That was the first thing the Golden State Killer said when law enforcement finally caught up with him after 4 decades. Not a denial, not a confession, not a threat, a roast in the oven. Joseph James DeAngelo had spent 13 years as a police officer. He had worn a badge. He had sworn an oath to protect the communities he served. And from behind that badge, using the knowledge, the access, and the authority that came with it, he had terrorized the entire state of California for over a decade. He killed at least 13 people. He attacked more than 50 women in their own homes. He committed over 100 burglaries across 11 counties. He operated under so many different names. The Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, that investigators in different parts of California spent years hunting what they believed were completely separate criminals. It was the same man, every single time, and for 40 years he lived freely. He retired. He became a grandfather. He stood in his driveway in tube socks and cargo shorts while the families of the people he had murdered grew old waiting for justice that never seemed to come. Until a genealogy website changed everything. On Hidden Crime Stories, we walk every step of this case. From the first break-in in 1974 to the arrest in that Citrus Heights driveway in 2018. From the investigators who spent their entire careers chasing a ghost to the woman who sat alone at her computer and built a family tree that finally gave that ghost a name. This is a story about the longest hunt in California criminal history. And it is a story about something that matters deeply and urgently to every single person watching right now. Because the lesson Joseph DeAngelo teaches us about trust, about authority, and about the faces we believe are safe is one we cannot afford to ignore. Stay with me. Bath, New York, 1945. Joseph James DeAngelo was born the second of 4 children. His father was in the military, and the family moved frequently. The kind of childhood built on impermanence, on constantly adjusting to new places and new people and new rules. By most outward measures, he was an unremarkable boy. He graduated from high school. He joined the Navy. He served during the Vietnam era. And then he came home and did something that, looking back, carries a weight that is almost impossible to fully process. He studied criminal justice. He earned a degree. He became a police officer. First in Exeter, California, a small town in the San Joaquin Valley, starting in 1973. Then later in Auburn, a city in the Sierra Nevada foothills east of Sacramento. People who worked alongside him in those years described him in ways that have since taken on a deeply uncomfortable resonance. He was unremarkable. Forgettable, a little odd. He stood too close to people, didn't handle criticism well, had a sullenness about him that surfaced when things didn't go his way, but nothing that screamed danger. Nothing that made anyone reach for an alarm. He had a fiancée, a woman named Bonnie Colwell. They were engaged to be married, and then she ended the relationship. Investigators who have spent years studying DeAngelo's psychology believe this moment. The loss of control, the rejection by a woman he believed he owned, lit something in him that never went out, something that expressed itself in the years that followed as an obsessive, predatory need to dominate and control the people around him. He began breaking into houses, not for money, not out of desperation, for the feeling of it, the power of moving through someone's private space without their knowledge, of taking things, of being there, invisible, present, completely in control, while the people who lived there slept just a few feet away. He called himself the Visalia Ransacker. He committed over 100 burglaries in Visalia between 1974 and 1975, ransacking homes, scattering women's underwear, stealing small personal items that had no monetary value but enormous psychological significance to the people who own them. He was a police officer doing this, sworn to protect the community, investigating crimes that he himself was committing. And then in September 1975, the burglaries escalated into something that could never be walked back. He broke into the home of a professor named Claude Snelling in the middle of the night. He was there to kidnap Snelling's teenage daughter. Claude Snelling confronted him. DeAngelo shot him dead on his own front lawn. He was still a serving police officer. He was still wearing a badge. Sacramento County, California. Something shifted in Joseph DeAngelo that year. The burglaries, the control, the invasion, the power of moving unseen through other people's lives were no longer enough. He needed more. In June 1976, a woman in Rancho Cordova reported being bound and attacked by a masked intruder who had broken into her home while she slept. It was the beginning of a campaign of terror that would consume the Sacramento area for the next 3 years and leave entire neighborhoods too frightened to sleep with their windows open. He became known as the East Area Rapist. His methodology was unlike anything investigators in Sacramento had encountered. He was not opportunistic. He was not impulsive. He was a man who had studied crime, who understood evidence, who understood how investigators built cases, who knew exactly what to leave behind and what to take with him. He stalked his victims for days before attacking. He learned their routines. He knew when they went to work and when they came home and when they turned off their lights. He cut phone lines before entering homes. He disabled means of escape. He moved through neighborhoods in the dark with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing this for years. Because he had been. When couples were home, he was at his most methodical and his most terrifying. He would bind the male victim, stack dishes on his back, and tell him that if he heard the plates fall, he would kill everyone in the house. Then he would be in complete, total, devastating control. He taunted his victims afterward. He made obscene phone calls to women he had attacked, sometimes months later, sometimes years. He wanted them to know he still existed. He wanted them to know he was still out there and they could never fully feel safe again. Between 1976 and 1979, he attacked more than 50 women across Sacramento and the surrounding areas. And he was still working as a police officer for part of that time. In October 1979, he was fired from the Auburn Police Department, not for the attacks. Nobody connected him to the attacks. He was fired for shoplifting, a hammer and a can of dog repellent from a store. A man who had committed over 100 burglaries and more than 50 attacks was fired from law enforcement for stealing a hammer. During the arrest for the shoplifting, he defecated himself, feigned a heart attack, fought store security, and then rolled around in his chair, pretending to be mentally unwell, before finally admitting it was an act. It was a window, one of the only real windows anyone ever got, into the person underneath the performance. A man capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary calculation who, when stripped of control, dissolved into something almost pathetic. He lost his badge in 1979. But he did not stop. Southern California, without a badge, without a uniform, without the structure that law enforcement had given his life for 6 years. Joseph DeAngelo moved south and became something even darker than what he had been before. The East Area Rapist, the name Sacramento knew him by, transformed into what investigators in Southern California would come to call the original Night Stalker. The attacks changed in character. They became more violent, more final. Where the East Area Rapist had left survivors, the original Night Stalker left bodies. On December 30th, 1979, Deborah Manning and Robert Offerman were found murdered in their home in Goleta, near Santa Barbara. In March 1980, Lyman and Charlene Smith were murdered in their home in Ventura. Their bodies were discovered by Lyman's 12-year-old son. In August 1980, Keith and Patrice Harrington were killed in their Dana Point home. Keith was a medical student. Patrice was a nurse. They had been married for less than a year. In February 1981, Manuela Whithoon was murdered in her Irvine home while her husband was in the hospital. In July 1981, Cherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez were murdered in Goleta. In May 1986, in what investigators believe was his final known attack, Janelle Cruz, 18 years old, was murdered in her home in Irvine. Then he disappeared, completely, totally, as if he had never existed. Investigators in Northern and Southern California spent years not even knowing they were hunting the same person. The crimes were geographically separated. The methods were similar but not identical enough, at that time without DNA technology, to conclusively connect them. It was not until 2001 that DNA testing finally confirmed what some investigators had long suspected. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same man. They gave him a new name, Aaron's, East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker. And later, when crime writer Michelle McNamara wrote about him in a magazine article in 2013, she gave him the name that the world would eventually come to know, the Golden State Killer. By 2001, when DNA finally connected the northern and southern crimes, Joseph DeAngelo was 55 years old. He was living quietly in Citrus Heights, the same neighborhood where he had attacked his first known victim in 1976. He was working as a mechanic. He had a daughter. He was somebody's neighbor, somebody's coworker. He was completely invisible, and investigators had nothing but DNA from crime scenes and the fading memories of survivors who had spent decades trying to forget. Before we go any further, I need to stop for just a moment and ask you something. If this story is gripping you the way I believe it is right now, take 5 seconds and subscribe to Hidden Crime Stories. Every single week we bring you cases exactly like this one. Real, deeply researched, told the way the victims deserve. Stories that stay with you. Stories that change how you see the world around you. And what we have coming in the next few weeks is something your true crime feed absolutely cannot be without. Hit that subscribe button right now, and let's get back to the hunt. Because what investigators did next is one of the greatest stories in the history of criminal justice. For 40 years, the Golden State Killer case was the great unsolved wound of California law enforcement. Investigators who dedicated their careers to it retired without closure. Survivors who had waited decades for justice began to lose hope that it would ever come. The families of victims, people like Bruce Harrington, whose brother Keith and sister-in-law Patrice had been murdered in Dana Point in 1980, spent years advocating for DNA legislation, testifying before the California Assembly, pleading for resources and attention and the basic acknowledgement that the people they loved deserved justice. Bruce Harrington spent 15 years pushing for California to expand its DNA database before investigators even confirmed there was a usable DNA sample from his brother's crime scene. 15 years. The investigation had its heroes. Detective Paul Holes of Contra Costa County spent his entire career working the case, pulling threads, building profiles, coordinating between jurisdictions, refusing to let the case go cold in its own mind even when official resources moved elsewhere. He was one of the architects of the renewed 2016 push, when the FBI held a national press conference, released new composite sketches, and offered a $50,000 reward for information, leading to an arrest. Nothing came of it immediately. But something else was happening. Something that nobody in traditional law enforcement had fully anticipated. A woman named Michelle McNamara, true crime writer, wife of comedian Patton Oswalt, and one of the most tenacious amateur investigators the case had ever attracted, had spent years researching the Golden State Killer obsessively. She was writing a book. She was building a network of online investigators who shared information, compared notes, and kept the case alive in the public consciousness at a time when official attention had ebbed. She called him the Golden State Killer, and that name stuck. Michelle McNamara died suddenly in her sleep in April 2016. Before she ever saw her work completed, before she ever got the answer she had spent years hunting. Her book was finished posthumously by her research team and published in 2018. It was called I'll Be Gone in the Dark. She never got to see what happened 2 months after it was published, because in April 2018, driven partly by the renewed public attention that McNamara's work had generated, investigators made a decision that would change criminal justice permanently. They uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile, preserved from crime scene evidence collected decades earlier, to a public genealogy database called GEDmatch. GEDmatch was not a law enforcement tool. It was a website where ordinary people voluntarily uploaded their own DNA profiles to find relatives and trace family histories. It had no connection to criminal databases. It was built for curiosity and connection. But DNA does not care about the purpose of the database it sits in. The upload identified between 10 and 20 people who shared the same great-great-great-grandparents as the Golden State Killer. A team of 5 investigators working with genealogist Barbara Ray Venter used that list to construct an enormous sprawling family tree, working forward through generations, cross-referencing ages, locations, physical descriptions, military records, and criminal histories. The tree produced 2 suspects. One was ruled out by a relative's DNA test. The other was a 72-year-old retired mechanic living in Citrus Heights, California. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. Investigators placed him under surveillance immediately. They watched him. They followed him. They needed his DNA. something he had touched, something he had left behind, to confirm what the genealogy work had suggested. On April 18, 2018, investigators collected a DNA sample from the door handle of DeAngelo's car. They collected another sample from a tissue he had discarded in his curbside garbage. Both samples were sent to the lab. Both matched the DNA profile of the Golden State Killer. 40 years, 13 murders, more than 50 attacks, over 100 burglaries, 11 counties, multiple names, one man, confirmed by a tissue in a garbage can. On April 24, 2018, investigators moved in. He was standing in his driveway, cargo shorts, tube socks, a roast in the oven. When they brought him into the interrogation room and left him alone with his thoughts, he sat in silence for nearly 2 hours, alone under fluorescent lights, staring at the walls, drawing in long, slow breaths. And then quietly, almost to himself, he said the words that investigators had waited 4 decades to hear. "I did all those things. I destroyed all those lives." June 29, 2020, Sacramento, California. Joseph DeAngelo stood in a courtroom and pleaded guilty. 13 counts of first-degree murder, 13 counts of kidnapping, and an admission, required by the terms of his plea agreement, to dozens of additional uncharged attacks described in devastating detail by prosecutors. The death penalty was taken off the table. He would receive life without the possibility of parole, the maximum sentence available given the legal complexities of prosecuting crimes committed across multiple decades and jurisdictions. But the sentencing hearing that followed in August 2020 was not about legal technicalities. It was about the survivors. For 3 days, August 18th through the 20th, survivor after survivor and family member after family member stood before Joseph DeAngelo and said what they had been waiting 40 years to say, directly to his face. Jane Carson Sandler, who had been attacked in 1976 while home with her young son, stood in that courtroom and described what it had been like to be frozen in fear while wondering where DeAngelo had put her child. She described the way a ski mask or the sound of someone yelling "shut up" still triggered a fear response in her body decades later. She told him directly. Her comfort in those moments was remembering that he was finally in prison and would stay there until he died. Bruce Harrington, who had spent 15 years advocating for DNA legislation in his brother's memory, addressed DeAngelo with the accumulated weight of 4 decades of grief and determination. Bonnie Colwell, the woman who had broken off her engagement to DeAngelo more than 40 years earlier, the woman investigators believe may have been a psychological trigger for the beginning of his crimes, walked into that courtroom and stood before him. She said nothing, she simply looked at him. Investigators who were present said that DeAngelo, who had maintained an almost robotic stillness throughout the proceedings, refusing to react to anything, stopped breathing for a moment when Bonnie walked in. The man who needed control. The man who had built his entire criminal identity around the domination of other people. The man who had terrorized California for a decade and then hidden for 40 years. Was undone, just for a moment, by the woman who had simply chosen to leave him. On August 21, 2020, Judge Michael Bowman sentenced Joseph James DeAngelo to 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional years on top. He will die in prison. At his sentencing, DeAngelo spoke, briefly, haltingly, in a voice that his victims described as unrecognizable from the voice they remembered from their attacks. He said he was truly sorry. The survivors who heard it had waited 40 years for those words. Most of them said it was not enough. None of them were wrong. Before I give you my final thoughts on this case, I want to talk to you directly for just a moment. If you have watched this far, you are exactly the person Hidden Crime Stories was built for. Someone who wants more than headlines, someone who wants to understand. If this story moved you, and I believe it did, please take 5 seconds right now and leave a comment below. Tell me what you think about this case. Tell me how it made you feel. Tell me what story you want us to tell next. Your voice shapes this channel. And if someone in your life needs to hear a story like this one, please share this video with them tonight. One share could put this in front of someone who genuinely needs it. Now, here is what I want you to carry from everything we have just walked through together. I want to start the closing with something that I think gets lost in almost every retelling of this case. The survivors, not DeAngelo. The survivors, because the true crime punk conversation around the Golden State Killer tends to focus, understandably, on the investigation, on the genealogy breakthrough, on the 40-year hunt and the extraordinary detective work, and the technology that finally cracked it. All of that is real and important and worth telling. but the women who were attacked in their own homes in Sacramento in the 1970s. The women who went on to live their lives carrying something nobody should ever have to carry. They are the center of this story, not the monster, not the method of his capture. They are the reason any of this matters. Jane Carson Sandler did not stop living after 1976. She raised her son. She built a life. She walked into a courtroom in 2020 and looked directly at the man who had terrorized her, and she spoke with a strength that Joseph DeAngelo, in all his planning, all his control, all his 40 years of hiding, never had and never will. That is the first thing this case is about. Survival, real, sustained, daily survival. The kind that doesn't make headlines but is more remarkable than anything investigators ever did. The second thing this case is about is authority. And this is the part I need you to really hear. Joseph DeAngelo was not a stranger in a dark alley. He was not a face you would have recognized as dangerous. He was a police officer, a man whose entire professional identity was built on the premise that he was safe, that he was trustworthy, that his presence in your neighborhood meant you were protected. He used that identity as a weapon. He used his knowledge of how crimes are investigated to avoid leaving evidence. He used his understanding of how victims and witnesses behave to predict and control the people he targeted. He used the uniform, the symbol of safety, as cover for what he was doing. And this is not a story unique to Joseph DeAngelo. The research on intimate partner violence, on predatory behavior, on the psychology of people who cause harm tells us the same thing over and over. The most dangerous people are not the ones who look dangerous. They are the ones who have learned, through intelligence, through practice, through deliberate cultivation, how to appear trustworthy, how to occupy the spaces that feel safe, how to wear the faces that we are conditioned to believe mean protection, a badge, a church pew, a wedding ring, a nursery painted for a baby that was never going to have the father it deserved. These are not guarantees. They are images, and images can be constructed by anyone. The third thing this case teaches us, and this one carries genuine hope, is about the power of science and patience combined. Paul Holes spent his entire career on this case. Michelle McNamara spent the last years of her life on it and died before she saw the answer. Bruce Harrington spent 15 years advocating for legislation that would eventually help catch the man who murdered his brother. The genealogist Barbara Ray Venter sat with an enormous family tree and worked forward through generations of names until one name was left standing. None of them were there for a single dramatic moment of inspiration. They were there for the long, unglamorous, patient, methodical work of refusing to let justice die. And because they refused, because all of them refused, across decades, across disciplines, across the vast and complicated machinery of investigation and advocacy and science, a 72-year-old man standing in his driveway in cargo shorts and tube socks finally ran out of places to hide. For the 13 people he murdered, for the more than 50 people he attacked in their own homes, for every family that spent 40 years waiting, it was not fast enough. It was not clean enough. It will never feel like enough. But it was justice. And in a world where justice sometimes feels impossible, where the darkness sometimes seems too patient and too dug in and too invisible to ever be fully reached, the Golden State Killer case is some proof that it is not. Patience outlasted him. Science outlasted him. The people he tried to destroy outlasted him. And he is going to die in a prison cell while every single survivor he tried to silence is still out there, still speaking, still standing.
Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested yesterday.
We've solved the case of the century.
April the 24th, 2018. The deadliest American murderer of the 20th century is arrested.
And as you can see, investigators are still pouring through this home here looking for evidence.
The serial killer, who had been on the run for almost 40 years, was living quietly in the suburbs of Sacramento.